When we talk about the great American story of heading west, we hear all these tales of triumph, of incredible endurance. But there's one name that it echoes with something much, much darker: the Donner Party. The name itself has become this chilling legend, right? A cautionary tale about what can happen out on the frontier. But behind that legend is the true story of 87 people, real people, families with kids, husbands, and wives, whose dream of California, this dream of sunshine and a fresh start, just twisted into the most unimaginable nightmare you can think of, trapped in ice and snow. So today, we're going to dig into the real story behind this absolutely harrowing chapter of American history. Now, these aren't some modern sensationalist headline somebody cooked up. They are the actual chapter titles from one of the very first, most detailed histories of what happened, written way back in 1879. These are the words that people close to the tragedy used to try and make sense of it all. And right away, they just set this terrifying, deeply personal stage for the ordeal we're about to explore. An ordeal that's all about the agony of loss, the horrifying reality of a camp of death, and a final desperate turn to the last and most awful taboo. So let's just try and picture the scene. It's late October 1846. You have this group of families. They are completely exhausted, but they're still hanging on to that last shred of hope. They're camped out by a big mountain lake, which we now call Donner Lake. They are so close. They're right on the edge of crossing that final barrier, the huge Sierra Nevada mountains. California and that promise of a new life, it's almost right there. And then, something that should not have happened happens. The winter storms, which usually hold off for another month, they just arrive with this sudden, shocking fury. Snow starts to fall, and it just doesn't stop. The wall between them and their dream isn't just rock anymore. It's quickly becoming this massive fortress of ice and snow. So how on earth did they end up in this trap? Well, it wasn't just one single mistake. It was like a domino effect, a whole cascade of them. Back in late July, they made the huge decision to take the Hastings Cutoff, this unproven route that promised to shave weeks off their trip. But then, just a few weeks in, they find a note from Hastings himself, warning them the road ahead is awful. But turning back, that felt like admitting defeat, and they'd lose even more time. So they pushed on, and they were forced to literally carve their own trail through the wilderness, which cost them a whole critical month. Then came the brutal crossing of the Great Salt Lake Desert, which just about broke them. It cost them dozens of their cattle and precious, precious supplies. And finally, in late October, dangerously behind schedule, they made one last, totally understandable, and completely fatal decision to just rest their worn-out cattle for a few days before that final push. That decision to rest, it cost them everything. Because by the time that rest was over and they finally got their wagons up to the mountain pass, it was too late. This is what was waiting for them: 5 feet of snow. An impassable, solid white barrier. Their wagons, their animals, their entire lives stopped dead in their tracks. They were maybe 100 miles from safety in the Sacramento Valley. The trap had sprung. So they're trapped. Their food is running out at a terrifying rate, and everyone knew that just sitting there and waiting meant they were all going to die. They had to get help. So a desperate plan was hatched. A small group, made up of the strongest men and women, would try to do the impossible: cross the mountains, which were just choked with snow, on foot. They made these crude, homemade snowshoes and packed a tiny amount of rations, just enough for 6 days. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. And that name, that wasn't for drama. It's an old military term, and it basically means a suicide mission. They knew their chances were next to nothing. And this group, this wasn't a bunch of lone adventurers. It was a collection of people making these unimaginable sacrifices. You had 10 men and 5 women. Mothers, like Harriet Pike, who had to make the agonizing choice to leave her nursing baby behind, gambling her own life on the tiny faint hope that she could save her child. You had Patrick Dolan, a bachelor who was described as this really jovial, generous guy. Before he left, he gave his entire personal supply of meat to another family. And then there was Charles Stanton. This man was a true hero. He was a young guy with no family in the party who had already crossed the mountains alone to get supplies from California and had come all the way back to guide them. He didn't even have to be there. And leading them were 2 Miwok guides, Louis and Salvador, who had been sent to help. These 15 people, they were the only chance for the more than 70 others freezing back at the lake. On their second day, against all odds, they did it. They reached the summit of the Sierra Nevada. Mary Graves, one of the young women in the group, later remembered this breathtaking, almost alien landscape of endless white peaks. I mean, in that one moment of triumph, looking down on the world from the frozen rooftop of the continent, It must have felt like they'd made it, right? They'd conquered the mountain. But the terrible, bitter irony is that while they might have been geographically near heaven, they were about to descend into a very, very real hell. It turns out going down was so much crueler than going up. The constant, glaring sun reflecting off that endless snow started to take its toll. The hero of the party, Charles Stanton, became snowblind. His eyes were in agony, and his strength, which was already stretched thin from his previous journey, just began to give out. He struggled to keep up, stumbling into camp long after everyone else each night. The very man who had come back to save them all was now the one who most desperately needed saving. And right then, their 6 days of rations ran out. They were gone, they were lost, they were starving, and they were exhausted. And then, just when you think it can't possibly get any worse, the weather turned. A storm of such incredible ferocity descended on them, and they were completely exposed. No shelter, no caves, nothing, just the open wilderness. The blizzard just pinned them in place, forcing them to huddle together in the snow as the wind and ice just raged around them. Their desperate journey had come to a dead stop. In the middle of this blizzard, somehow, they managed to build a fire, their only source of warmth. They built it on what they thought was solid ground, but it was actually a massive snowdrift. And as the night went on, the heat from the fire melted this deep well in the snow right underneath it. And then, the absolute ultimate horror, the bottom gave way, and their entire fire, their light, their warmth, their only comfort in the world, it just vanished, dropped down into a hidden stream flowing deep beneath the snow. And just like that, they were left in total darkness in a raging blizzard with the temperature plummeting and zero hope of relighting a flame. What happened next was just a complete breakdown of body and mind. Huddled together under blankets as the snow just piled up over them, they started to die. In that first awful, fireless night, 4 people froze to death. Starvation brought on this terrible delirium. Survivors later recalled waking up and finding themselves unconsciously chewing on their own hands and fingers. And it was here, in this frozen tomb, that the conversation finally turned to the unspeakable. To what one account called a dreaded resort, the ultimate taboo. And really, this is the question at the very heart of the Donner Party's story. It's a question we all hope we never, ever have to answer for ourselves. When every single other option is gone, when you are literally watching yourself and the people around you die a slow death from starvation, what lines are you willing to cross? What's the price of one more day of life? For the Forlorn Hope, this wasn't some philosophical debate anymore. It was the only question left that mattered. And what's so crucial to understand here is that this wasn't some descent into animalistic savagery. In a way, it was a calculated, absolutely heartbreaking act of love. Franklin Ward Graves, a father who was there with his wife and kids, he knew he was dying. And with his last breaths, he spoke these words to his daughters, Mary and Sarah. He gave them permission. He transformed the ultimate taboo into a father's final, selfless gift, his own body offered up so that his children might have a chance to live. But not everyone made that same choice. The 2 Miwok guides, Louis and Salvador, they refused to eat the human flesh. They actually built their own small fire away from the main group, and as the histories tell it, with true Indian stoicism, endured the agonies of starvation. This stark contrast, it just showed that even in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, there were still lines, cultural, spiritual, personal lines, that some people would not cross, even if it meant their own death. Okay, so while the Forlorn Hope was fighting this desperate battle up in the high peaks, the situation for the 70 or so people left behind in the cabins by the lake, it was becoming just as dire. They had no idea if help was coming, or if their would-be saviors were already dead in the snow. All they knew was this gnawing, relentless hunger and the constant, suffocating presence of the snow all around them. At this point, the word food pretty much ceased to have any real meaning. They ate anything that could provide the slightest bit of sustenance. They dug up the frozen hides of their dead oxen, they scraped the hair off and boiled them for hours and hours until they dissolved into this foul, gluey jelly. They boiled old, discarded bones over and over until they were soft enough to crumble and swallow. One survivor, a boy at the time, remembered how the little kids, playing by the fire, would cut off small pieces of the oxhide rug in front of the hearth, toast them on the coals, and eat them. One of the men, Patrick Breen, kept this sparse but incredibly powerful diary, and through his entries you can actually track the relentless march of death. The toll was steady at first, a few deaths in December, a few more in January, but as the winter just ground on, and the last of those so-called starvation rations disappeared, the pace just accelerated. In the first part of February alone, 8 people died. Their bodies were just buried in the giant snowbanks that had become their prison walls. But even in this absolute abyss of suffering, there were these little flickers of profound humanity. Margaret Reed, her husband had actually been banished from the party months earlier. She was one of the most desperate, but somehow she had managed to save a secret treasure for her 4 starving children. On Christmas morning, she brought it out: a single teacup of beans, a few scraps of bacon, some dried apples, and a tiny bit of rice. And for one meal, her children ate real food. They apparently laughed and cried with joy at the sight of it. It was just this fleeting, heartbreaking moment of grace, right in the middle of hell. After 33 agonizing days, 7 survivors of the Forlorn Hope literally stumbled into a settlement in California. Their story immediately sparked a response, and in mid-February of 1847, the first relief party fought its way back over the mountains. But the rescuers, they were not prepared for what they were about to find. The people who came out of those snow-buried cabins weren't hardy pioneers. They were skeletal, wild-eyed apparitions, covered in filth, their humanity almost completely extinguished by months of starvation. And the final toll of this whole tragedy, it's just laid bare in the numbers. Of the 87 members of the Donner Party who were trapped by that first snow, only 48 would live to see California. Nearly half of them died. And for the Forlorn Hope, the numbers were even worse. Of the 15 who set out on that desperate gamble, only 7 survived. The price of survival was just astronomically high. And for those who did make it out, the ordeal was far from over. They carried the physical and the mental scars for the rest of their days, and they were forever marked by the terrible choices they had to make. They weren't just celebrated as survivors. They were stigmatized, known to the world forever as the Cannibal Party. The horror of the Sierra Nevada, it followed them for the rest of their lives. And yet, let's just look at this number one more time: 48. Despite the fatal delays, the impossible storms, the starvation, the absolute horror, 48 people endured. They survived an ordeal that, by all rights, should have taken every single one of them. Their story is a tragedy, there is absolutely no question. But it is also one of the most extreme and, most unsettling testaments to the sheer, stubborn, and sometimes terrifying power of the human will to live. And that really just leaves us with this one final lingering question. The Donner Party. It was like a miniature society, a group of families suddenly just cut off from the entire world. When all the rules of civilization were literally buried under 20 feet of snow and survival became the only law, what did it even mean to be human anymore? The story of the Donner Party doesn't give us any easy answers. Instead, it forces us to confront the terrifying fragility of our own humanity and to ask ourselves what we might be capable of if we were pushed to the absolute limit.